Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Traversing the Stars podcast. How are my loyal listeners? Thank you for your continued support. And as always, hit that subscribe button, everybody. We have an amazing show for you all because board the mothership is Dr. Erin MacDonald. She has a PhD in astrophysics. She's the owner of Spacetime Productions, and now she's a science advisor for the entire Star Trek franchise. Now come join me as Traversing the Stars. Hello, Miss McDonald. Thank you so much for coming to the Traverse the Stars podcast.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm really happy. It's great.
It's totally my pleasure. I really wanted to talk with you, and I'm looking forward to this.
Good. I'm glad. Me too.
Now, you have a degree in something I've always been fascinated by. You have a PhD in astrophysics, and I love astrophysics. I don't quite have the brains probably to get a PhD in it, but I do enjoy it. So I think that's really cool. So what inspired your goal to be an astrophysicist, and who are your earliest influences?
Yeah, my earliest influences were pretty much from film and television. I loved the X-Files. I loved watching Dana Scully fight aliens with science, and I just wanted to be her. And I think like most kids, we grow up and love space and dinosaurs, when we're like 8 years old. That's all that exists, and it's the coolest thing in the world. And so I always had that drive. And then another sort of person that inspired me was Dr. Ellie Arroway from Contact. So between Dana Scully and Ellie Arroway, I was just like, oh, these are cool people. Like, this is who I want to be and what I want to do. And honestly, like, I didn't necessarily go into astrophysics wanting to have it as like a long-term career. I just loved the idea that I could go to a university and just study space for 4 years, because you don't really get a chance to do that when you're in high school,
Right.
And then I enjoyed it. I got to do research as an undergraduate, and so I decided to keep doing it, and went on to do my PhD.
That's very cool, and it begs two questions. Your information. Question number one. So, as someone who was, as you said, growing up, everyone wants to be a dinosaur and love space. Since you're an astrophysicist, that imply you've never actually grown up.
I am perfectly fine with that. Yes, I think that it is funny because people do love. I mean, it's like anytime space is in the news, anytime dinosaurs are in the news, like it just kind of captures this imagination from people. So I don't think anyone really grows out of it. I'm just lucky enough that I get to just be a kid all the time.
No, I agree. And as a lover of X-Files, the important question for the astrophysicist, are they out there? I'm sure you get that a lot. Are they out there?
I am like perfectly balanced between Mulder and Scully. It's like the epitome of I want to believe. Like, trust me, if there was good evidence that there were aliens here, I would be advertising it everywhere. However, like, I do think that the odds are so high that there has to be some sort of life that's on other planets out there, probably, and even in our own galaxy. And so that certainly, the odds are in that favor, whether they've come here or not. I mean, again, I want to believe.
Well,
but I can't.
How about in our solar system? There are a few moons that are possibilities. Do you think we're actually going to find something here, or do you think probably at least whatever it is at least outside the solar system?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. I think there's a really good chance that there is some form of life, whatever that looks like, even here in our own solar system. Part of what like Perseverance was going to Mars to study was to try to find evidence of ancient life, even if it was just microbes. Because when Curiosity's sort of primary mission was to see what evidence there was of water and how much water there was and how long it was there for. And it found that, yes, there was water, and there was there for a really long time. It found sort of those layered rocks. And so Perseverance went there to try to, and is still looking for evidence that there is possibly some life. But the big candidate for me, as you mentioned, those moons, is Europa primarily. Europa is one of Jupiter's moons. It's an icy moon. It orbits really fast. It's very close within Jupiter's gravity field. And it has a water core, and with even more water than there is here on Earth. And what's really key with Europa is that because it's in something called orbital resonance with two of the other Galilean moons, two of other Jupiter's moons, it meets at the same point every time. So it gets churned. That's why, if people might have seen, it's the icy moon that looks like it has a lot of cracks on it. It's because it's constantly being pulled by Jupiter and these other moons. And those tidal forces heat up the inside. So we have a warm water core. And not only that, they've discovered that as Europa passes through Jupiter's magnetic field, we see residual evidence that there are like ions in the water, which is like salt. And so it's very likely that we have a warm saltwater ocean under the surface of Europa. The big challenge is not if there's something there, but we have to scrub a spacecraft like nobody's business before we send it there to start digging. Because like, one, if we do find something, we want to be 99.999% sure that that was something we found and not something we carried with us. And two, it's a prime directive, man. Like, we don't want to introduce any bacteria into a warm saltwater environment, because that's where it would thrive. So yeah, my money's on Europa, and man, the day we find, even if it's like fossilized microbes, I will lose my mind. Like, that's going to be a great day.
So the thing with Europa, I mean, obviously we're spending a lot of time giving our energy to Mars. We're planning on getting to the moon, I think by like 2025, something along those lines. Why aren't we spending more time trying to get ourselves to Europa and trying to, because I mean, understanding, and once again, obviously my knowledge is not gonna be where yours is on the subject, but basically we got to pummel through a bunch of surface to get underneath. So we would have come up with a craft that can basically ram itself through. You know,
Yeah.
it's 21st century. Why haven't we been able to pull this? Can we pull this off yet?
Space is really hard and complicated, and they don't give us a lot of money. It's really the quick answer. And actually, there is a mission planned to go to Europa later in this decade, to do exactly that. I unfortunately, off the top of my head, don't remember the name of it, but they are planning on doing that and doing exactly what we talked about: landing it on the surface, probing through the ice, studying the water. But again, like, there's such a challenge with that. Not only is Jupiter far away, got to get through the asteroid belt. There's lots of other sort of being able to hit that exact mark when you're as far away as Jupiter is really tough. And then just all the science involved. We have to implement, when you're doing a mission like that, that's in the outer reaches of our solar system, it requires a lot of machine learning and autonomous sort of abilities that for this type of mission we haven't really done before. But you know, challenge accepted, right? Like, let's figure it out, because it's really cool. And what is a shame is I just wish that like we had so much money for all of this space exploration, because then we could send humans to the moon and do more research on Mars and send something to Europa. All above. Like, why not? So yeah.
Well, which I think it begs some very important questions, and that I kind of want to cover with you a little bit. As a scientist, do you think that part of your job is to sell space to the populace? I mean, are you part salesman as much as scientist to obviously fund the rest of your interests?
Yeah, I think being a science communicator has a lot more weight to it than I think some people think. You know, there's a lot of people out there. There's more, let me say, there's not a lot, but there's more than zero people out there who believe the earth is flat. And
Yes.
so, you know, with things like that, I think what's really important is when you get asked a question like, is the earth really round? Did we really land on the moon? Why do we have seasons? Like, these sort of questions that you almost kind of balk because they're unexpected and you're like, everyone knows this. As a scientist, you have to remember that when someone's asking you that question, a lot of times it's genuine, and it's just because they don't have a scientist in front of them that they can ask this to all the time. And so for me, it's really important to not make people feel dumb, because that's going to then sour them against scientists in general and kind of make them not want to ask a question like that when they have another opportunity. So I always try to take those questions really seriously. And one of the best advice that I heard when it came to engaging, especially with something like flat Earth, was just kind of a little bit mind-boggling with that. Is to just ask the question, like, is there anything I could say that would change your mind? And sometimes they'll say no. And so it's like, okay, well, then we're done here, because there's no point.
Right,
You're
right.
just trying to trap me in some sort of weird logic spiral bubble that is not going to be worth anyone's time at this point. But I do think it's important for scientists to really treat people who do not have a science background with patience and respect, and understand that a lot of people are not exposed to scientists every single day in the way that we are.
Agree. At the school where I teach, is a high school, and I had on as one of my guests, the head of outreach at NASA, guest
Cool.
to, and when the first question one of my students asked was, "Is the world flat?" And my jaw just, like, I was like, "Oh shit!" I was like,
Oh no.
like, I mean, luckily I'm not the science teacher. I'm the English teacher, so I can at least be like, it's not my fault. But I was like, "Uh-oh."
Yeah.
I always wanted to stop the interview, be like, okay, let's start class at World 101. World not flat.
Yeah, seriously. It's so tough, and especially just trying to count. I think right now it's very tough to be a public scientist, just because you're trying to counteract so much misinformation that's out there. But again, it just requires a lot of patience and a lot of empathy and kindness. And sometimes it's frustrating, but then there's alcohol out there, so it's fine.
I do find there's two types of people out there, non-science, pro-science individuals. There's the ignorant, and then the other group that I hear a lot. And I actually I watch like Bill Maher, and he says all the time, it kind of pisses me off. He goes, we have too many problems on Earth. Why are we worrying about space? And I'm thinking to
Yeah.
myself, and I hear that all the time. I'm thinking to myself, one, we should be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. And as a scientist, will there not be the things that we need to understand to help us get to these planets and moons? Will that not help us somewhere here in some way?
Yeah.
And how can you sell those people on the importance of the discoveries, this effort to go to these places and all that?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked that question a lot. Like, I hear that a lot, is why are we wasting our money? Why is the money being sent there when we have so many other problems here on Earth? Or even within the scientific community, there are people who are like, hey, why are we looking at space? We still have stuff in the oceans. We still have pandemics to deal with. Like, why are we wasting any money on space when we
Right.
should be solving those problems here? But the big thing is kind of what you alluded to, is that space is really hard and scary. Like, it's really tough. It's really tough. And it's so much so that, like, our minds can't really process like how big space is and how isolating and
Mm.
how dangerous it is. And so when we try to do these big grand challenges, even just getting a rocket off of the surface in a different way, that forces us to research new technologies that we wouldn't be forced into researching otherwise. So things, I did my research in gravitational waves, which was like this theoretical, off the wall. I mean, for a long time, we were very fringe scientists, because it was like this one thing that Einstein had predicted 100 years ago. And even he said, like, they're there, but no one will ever see them. And there was just this group of scientists who were so dedicated to discovering these theoretical gravitational waves. We got asked all the time, why are we giving you your money? We don't even know if we can detect these or not. But we kept working on it. And the technology that we developed, I worked a lot in like the data science. And so a lot of sort of machine learning algorithms to try to dig out signals that were heavy, heavy noise, to try to do big data management from all of this sampling that we're doing from multiple detectors, terabytes plus of data, trying to sift through that. But even just the technological aspect, trying to build, the gravitational wave detectors, without getting too much into it, but they're basically looking at the length changing as you send laser beams down an arm. It hits a mirror, it comes back, it goes down another arm that's like an L shape. They recombine. And when a gravitational wave passes by, those lengths slightly change. And so the mirrors that the lasers reflect detecting, we have noise components that are like the quantum uncertainty of the photons, because they're not going to be perfect every time. The little bit of heat that the laser vibrates those mirrors and slightly heats that up, all of that are noise sources. Like, that's an insane challenge to be able to do. And so the technology that we learned with mirror coatings, with cryogenics, with optics, with suspension, like all of those things can now be applied in other fields, and it kind of pushed those boundaries possibly further than they would have gone otherwise.
So when you're thinking in terms of gravitational waves and the research that you did, what is the impact of that research as far as what does it mean to us? And us, I guess I say non-PhD smart people, that we now have that information. What does that mean? How does that further understanding of what gravity is? Because I mean, my understanding is we all understand gravity at a basic level. You jump, gravity pulls you back down to earth, things of that nature. But the more I've gone into astrophysics, and watched and read and stuff like that, it's far more complicated than what's taught in high school. So what does understanding that and gravitational waves mean for the impact of that on our understanding of just how the universe works?
Yeah, it's a great sort of journey that science goes on when it comes to gravity. Like you said, what we learn in high school is that Newtonian gravity, that this was Isaac Newton, the apple falls on the head, the idea that is gravity is a force between two objects that goes down by the square of the distance between them. You move it twice as far, it goes down by 4. But when sort of the late 1800s, scientists were doing more observing in space and we're doing more experiments, and it wasn't quite lining up. The big problem there was Mercury's orbit. So Mercury precesses the sun, which means that as it goes around the sun, it traces out a flower shape, where its peak kind of moves every time it goes around. And with Newtonian gravity, that shouldn't do that. Like, it meant that there should be another planet there that's tugging on Mercury that's making that happen. For the Star Trek fans out there, they actually named it Planet Vulcan, which is delightful to me. You can find these old 19th century star maps with Planet Vulcan on it. But that cyclical relationship of observing in theory that astronomy has, telescopes got better. We were able to predict where Vulcan should be, didn't see it. So there starts to be these cracks in Newtonian gravity. Again, it works good enough for now, but it's not the whole story. Einstein came along, and mathematicians had thought of this idea of our universe as being 4-dimensional. We move in 3-dimensional space, and we also go forward 1 second per second in time. And so that's what we call space-time. Einstein asked the question, well, what happens to space-time when you introduce mass? And for a lot of people, that's the analogy of putting a bowling ball on a trampoline, right? Space-time is your trampoline. You put a bowling ball on it, it's going to dip down. You can flick a marble, and that marble will start processing around the bowling ball, or it'll curve around. And so Einstein came up with that idea, worked for Mercury's orbit. Then they were able to test that light actually did curve. So imagine you flick that marble really hard, it's just going to curve its way around the bowling ball. And then it appears to be in a different position from the sort of recipient side. And then with gravitational waves, what's really cool is it's like Einstein came up with this idea. It worked for Mercury's orbit, seemed to answer everything. They were able to test it with the lensing, the light shifting as it goes around a gravity well. But with the gravitational waves, we were actually able to detect ripples in we were able to detect the trampoline itself rippling, not just how things move on the trampoline, from colliding black holes. So there's so much, again, this is all very theoretical, but it's the stuff that really draws people in, like black holes and supernovas and crashing stars and all of that stuff. As these collide, you can imagine like pebbles in a pond, they send out these ripples. And what's really exciting about it from an astronomy perspective is this is a totally different way of looking at our universe. Traditionally, we've looked at our universe with light. Now, it might be radio, it might be X-ray, it might be visual, gamma rays, all of those, but it's all forms of electromagnetic radiation, forms of light. With gravitational waves, it's not sound, but it's as if we can now hear the universe. We've just been looking at the universe. Now we're using a totally different sense to actually observe the universe. And we've been able now to detect things like a gamma ray burst and a gravitational wave that happened at the same time that tells us that 2 neutron stars colliding caused that gamma ray burst. So it's just what we can learn about our universe is just expanding now exponentially with LIGO.
That is absolutely awesome. I think it's amazing to think of, I mean, from my perspective, that people are able to figure that stuff out. I mean, the complexity of the universe, the size of the universe, the great mysteries are there, and it tells me that eventually everything will be understood by people given time, given enough research, given enough work upon work, enough shoulders to stand on. We'll solve everything. We'll solve it all.
And I think never having that attitude that we have solved it all. That was the thing. We could have just sat back and said, yep, Newton's gravity, that's it. That's how it works. That's what the universe does. But continuing to just be like, oh, but that doesn't seem quite right. Like, let's just keep digging. Or I wonder what else I wonder if we can make that telescope bigger, or I wonder how much better we can get. And then the things that we learn from that. What I love about astronomy is that it is this cyclical relationship of observing and theory, because we can't build this stuff in a lab. We just have to see what the universe gives us and then piece these, puzzles together to try to figure out how the universe works. And it challenges our understanding of physics in a really exciting way, I think.
So so the project you worked on for gravitational waves contributed to a Nobel Prize in Physics in 2017. So how big of a deal was that? Does Nobel drop the ball by not having everyone involved get recognition and having their name in there?
That's a heavy question. So yeah, I mean, there's sort of this tradition that with the Nobel Prize that they only awarded, I think, to 3 people is the maximum, maybe 3 or 4. And I, like you said, this collaboration that I worked in to detect gravitational waves was over 1,000 people and over 50 universities who'd worked for decades together to make this happen. And that is a big controversy that, the Nobel Prize traditionally was kind of born in a time where we didn't do that level of collaborative science, because you just couldn't. Like, imagine, these scientists at Oxbridge in the UK, working with 500 other people. That's just unheard of. But, between CERN was kind of the detection of the Higgs boson, which also won a Nobel Prize. And then this LIGO detection, both of those really challenged how we think about how scientists operate and how we award and recognize those scientists. Now, I do have to say, with a big old asterisk next to my background, I left the collaboration in 2014. In 2015, they made their Nobel Prize winning detection. So my attitude is that, I helped loosen the jar lid. And again, alcohol exists.
Now, when I'm talking about the Nobel Prize, is it the reason it is limited is because it's money? Is it just because it's easier to name 2 people to the public than saying, here's a list of 1,000 people who we think deserve a win?
Yeah, I think it's just tradition. It's just baked into tradition. And what the really unfortunate aspect of that is that it traditionally continues to go to old white dudes because they've been in the field the longest, because of, all the biases in our culture, and that they were able to get higher in their fields than anyone else. And so they've been working in this field for 60 plus years. So of course they're going to award it to the guys that were there at the beginning, not recognizing that other people just didn't have that opportunity to work in the field at the beginning. So it's a little bit of like an archaic award, I think, especially in that aspect, that it overlooks. But I think with us as a society understanding that bias and being like, yeah, these 3 dudes won the Nobel Prize, but really the detection of gravitational waves won the Nobel Prize. And that's something that everyone can be proud of. And there are other awards that recognize the whole group. It was like, I remember, because I still have friends who worked in it, and they won like a European prize that, was like a few million euros. And I think like everyone got like 25 quid. It just distributed it to everyone.
Because like the question I was going to ask you is like, is it coincidence that the 3 people who won the Nobel Prize in 2017 were all men? I think 2 for the collaboration, and 1 I think was a different for something different. I can't quite recall. But is that coincidence? Is that once again, further evidence of a male-dominated field. And because it's male-dominated, how do we encourage more women to then get interested in the sciences?
Yeah, I think certainly the guys who won it, having known them, they are all great guys. Some of them have passed since then. Ray Weiss, I think, in particular. But again, it's just recognizing that they were able to be at the top of their field because of the benefits given to them 50, 60, 70 years ago. I mean, these guys held in with LIGO until they made that detection. Like, no one was retiring when I was sort of going through grad school because they were like, we're so close. But I do think, and again, just trying to be vocal about it, recognize it, and show how many other people do work in it, and at least give that recognition, I think does go a long way. And again, reiterating that people remember that the gravitational waves won the Nobel Prize, not necessarily those three dudes were solely responsible for it. And then in terms of like the representation and just giving a face to other people that, to inspire kids who want to see themselves as scientists, that was one of the hardest things for me with leaving academia, was that I felt like I was depriving future generations of seeing a woman in the research department that they could relate to. I mean, I'm not just a woman, I'm heavily tattooed, I'm into heavy metal music, like, I've got these other aspects of my personality that people can realize, oh, I could be a scientist too, she looks like that. And that made it really hard for me to leave because I felt that responsibility. But then realizing that, yes, I have this technical background, but it doesn't mean I have to work in the field necessarily. And I can still be a science communicator and find other ways to mentor and encourage kids to get into science. And for me, that's like working in television right now, going back to my roots. That was when I finally had the epiphany. I was like, oh no, I'm not meant to like become Dana Scully. I'm meant to like write characters that are like Dana Scully and get characters like that on television so kids can see themselves in that role.
Is the issue with not for women and not getting enough into science, is it an issue of, is it opportunity, is it confidence, is it expectations, where are we lacking?
I think the biggest thing is opportunity. It's just making sure that everyone is able to access the same resources, and being able to have internet, being able to have television, being able to have all these things that make science more accessible to you is really important. So opportunity is a big aspect of it. But the ability to have like mentorship and continuing inspiration, that's what I think is so great now, as opposed to kind of when I grew up, was the advent of social media and YouTube, and just having kids have more access to different types of scientists that certainly like I did. I had like Bill Nye and Dana Scully. that was it. And so yeah, the access and the opportunity I think is really important. And then we talk, this is like a whole field of study, right? Is how to retain people interested in science. I talked about every 8-year-old being into space and dinosaurs. Problem is like, well, what happens to those kids when they turn 12, and suddenly, why aren't they into space anymore? Why did that kid stop? Some of it has to do with the way we teach, particularly math. Math is sometimes not taught very great. I think it should be taught more like a language. Makes it feel a lot less accessible to kids. They don't see the applications of it, and so they don't think that it's something they can do. And then just having, more kind of encouragement and opportunity, and ridding our society of the language of just saying like, putting people in boxes of like, oh, you're so smart, like you're going to become a scientist, or like, oh, math isn't your thing, write all of this stuff out. Like, you don't have to be that specific. You can still encourage people like, yeah, math is cool. You can still be super into books and into math, and you don't have to do it all.
Well, I mean, just going to kind of what we're going to go a little bit now into some of the stuff that you're doing right now, but is some of it also the impact of media? Because obviously, I mean, I know like when my father grew up, this is going back in the 50s and 60s, like you have the original Star Trek. Basically, it's men, but you have the space secretary, the space nurse, and the space gopher. But you don't have the women. Later on, like you had Janeway captaining the ship. You now have Burnham captaining the ship. those weren't things you would see in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Is this another example of first it happens on TV and then eventually real life will follow?
I do think so. And I think the legacy of Star Trek has shown this. Gene Roddenberry was very savvy in what he could push the societal limits without going too far, without making people go, whoa, what? That's too much. And I think like having Uhura on the bridge, just having like a Black woman, I mean, that was something I think that Whoopi Goldberg said, was just turning on the TV and seeing a woman, not a Black woman on the TV who wasn't a servant. Like that was huge in its own right, whether or not she's answering calls from aliens, and passing that on to Captain Kirk. The fact like what Nichelle Nichols brought to that character was so influential, just from the ability for people to see themselves in roles that they didn't see themselves in otherwise. And that really goes to that core of representation and how important that is. And one of my favorite examples is, you mentioned Janeway. She's my captain, but I really see myself as Janeway, like the personality type, the way she leads, the way she problem solves, her taste in men, like all of that. Like I really relate to Janeway. But I had a friend in graduate school who worked on the engineering aspect of LIGO. She was hugely attached to B'Elanna Torres. So it shows it's so important to like not just have a token character, but to show like so many different types of people and characters and representation. And yeah, B'Elanna Torres spoke to her as a woman engineer, but she also speaks to other people from, her background with being but half human, half Klingon, and like how she struggles with that stuff. And what I think is so exciting now with Star Trek, I think particularly in Star Trek Discovery, so you mentioned Captain Burnham, but now we have characters like Adira, who's non-binary. We have Gray being played by a trans actor. And so we continue to uphold that legacy of representation and just showing people on the television screen just existing and just being these roles that they wouldn't be otherwise.
Well, one cool thing that you're doing as well, you own a production company called Spacetime Productions. So what inspired the creation of that, and what are the goals of the company?
So one of the exciting things for me was, being part of this industry, being in this industry for a long time, and having this friends and these networks of really skilled people. My background being in engineering as a program manager, I looked at producing and I just realized like, this is something I can probably do. It's just project management. I have to hire people. I have to manage a budget. I have to get a movie made. And
Right.
I like that a lot more than launching satellites into space. So like, let me see what I can do with that. And so with this company, I had the opportunity to do it really formally. And so Mary and I and her girlfriend she wrote the short film, Maddie Goff. Her and Mary starred in it. We had this idea as I was making the company at the end of last year. So it was about 9 months ago. We filmed it in April and we're literally sending it off to festivals right now. And it's like really good. And we were able to tell like an LGBTQ themed sci-fi story with women leads. And we were lucky enough to get Terry Farrell to have a special appearance in it. She played Jadzia Dax from Deep Space Nine.
Very cool.
Yeah, and it was great. I mean, it was like film school for us. And what excited me the most, I think, about doing this was being able to give opportunities to really talented, creative people that are just in that same situation we are, just waiting for that break, waiting for that opportunity. And so I'm really proud, like our crew was almost 60% women, 10% non-binary. Like we just had such great representation on set. We had a lot of people in the LGBTQ community on set. And so many people just reflected on like, this feels great. Like this is not normally what we get to work on. And I think we came out with a really good product. And working in the industry, short films are kind of used as a calling card because people will work as maybe, like a key gripper, a gaffer, like these, so-called below the line jobs on these big films, but they're, fourth, fifth, 10th in the credits. And so when they are the one person doing that job on a short film, then they're able to at least point to that and say, no, like that, I was in charge of that for this movie and we were able to get this made. So yeah, I'm really excited to see what happens. We're hitting the festival circuit this year. So it's not publicly available yet, but it's great. It's really good.
That's so cool. Like I said, and so when you're imagining the film every morning, um, when you were thinking about why is this the film to now represent Spacetime Production, like I'm sure you had a few options. This wasn't your only thought. You're like, oh, let's do this one. Why did you land on this one? Going, this is the representation for us. This is who we're going to show ourselves as.
Thank you for that question. I think again, it's kind of a story that you don't get to see often, and you don't get to see that type of crew demographic. So it's like it's unique both in front of the screen and behind the screen. We don't normally get to see LGBTQ themed sci-fi stories, let alone those with women in them. And then on top of that, the women in the film are scientists. And so we just have this representation that you just don't normally see on your screen. And then to also have the crew behind that backing that story, I think that's what was so exciting for a first film like this. It's expensive. It's like I finally deeply relate to all those people at award ceremonies who were just like, I maxed out every credit card making this stupid movie. Because you do get to that point, because it's you're trying to do it for real, and it gets hard and it gets expensive and it gets timely. But the passion behind it was just giving these opportunities. Telling the story of every morning was being able to kind of share a love story that a lot of people don't normally see themselves in. So I really want to just uplift stories that are not normally in front of people. And I think there's still a lot more opportunity that we have out there for these stories.
Well, and as you said, the filmmakers are composed of 6% of women, 10% non-binary. How does this diversity create a unique voice for the project?
Yeah, I think what's so exciting about that is the perspective that you're able to tell. That when we have a woman director and we have like a young woman cinematographer, and they're able to sort of put the creative force behind the story, it's like a story that they also are excited to tell. That's what was so fun when we were trying to hire people for this. Like I said, we kind of had a network. We assembled some friends, people that we knew in the industry who were professionals, but waiting for that opportunity. So we got them, but then there were roles that we needed to hire. And so reaching out to people and saying, here's a sci-fi love story that we're excited to tell that's being run by women. I mean, there were a lot of people who were just like, sign me up. Like, I will do this. I will sacrifice a bunch of days and not necessarily be paid as much as I could be for that weekend, because it's the type of story we want to tell. And I really feel like that passion and dedication has carried with that film all the way through, from pre-production to filming to throughout the post-production.
So the thing with short films, once again, they may be in film like festivals, things of that nature. But normal people like me who don't get to go to festivals, where can someone like me catch every morning?
So once we go through the festival circuit, a lot of stuff is, in order to qualify for these festivals, you can't have it be publicly available because they want it to premiere at the festival. But once we go through that, so probably in the early spring next year, we'll have it online and we'll have a link to it and people can go and watch it. With short films, there's like two strategies that you can do with it. One is that it's its own story. The other one is that it's a proof of concept for a longer film. And we chose to go with it as a standalone story. So it really is its own thing. It's about half an hour long, so it's a good story. And what's exciting is, I think with TV shows like Black Mirror, Electric Sheep, like all these other ones, people are Love, Death, and Robots. The general public is starting to get used to short films, I think, in a way that we haven't otherwise. And so having these anthologies of short films that are maybe half an hour long, some are even, 10, 15 minutes, you realize how much can be told in that short period of time. And
Mm.
so, yeah, we'll see what happens, but, assuming it's not like picked up and carried and does all the fancy things, we'll have it publicly available for people to watch.
Well, how great is it that streaming exists for a film like this? I mean,
Yeah.
is the fact that there is streaming availability out there and all the different streaming apps and things of that nature, does that increase the probability that your film be accessible to the audience?
Yeah, and that's what I think is so great, is that we can just send it to people and have people watch this story and be able to show it, wherever. And yeah, technology is amazing, and it just increases this accessibility. And circling back to what we were talking about the importance of representation on screen, having this film available for people to watch, I think is great.
So, okay, so now assuming once again, you said this is kind of like a proof of you know concept of quality of your Spacetime company. So it goes to film festivals. It does awesome, which I assume it will.
Thanks.
What's coming up after? What's the next project that you guys are now working on to build upon the success of this one?
What's next? Well, I'm out of money. So the next step will be working on that, but also just finding more opportunities to maybe collaborate. I'm hoping that, like with a lot of people, this film will be their calling card for their capabilities as creatives in the industry. But I think for me, it hopefully will open the door to being able to collaborate with other people, maybe more established production companies on projects. Give me, just as a sole person running it, the opportunity to work more in the producer space, which, like I
Mm.
said, I really enjoy. And I think I'm really proud of, like I said, the crew that we assembled, how quickly this film got done, and the quality to which we were able to complete it. I think it shows what my capabilities are as a producer, and showed me that I love doing that. So I'm excited to see what more can come.
Have you looked into crowdfunding for your next project?
Yeah, because people asked us why we didn't crowdfund. Both, especially Mary and I, have social presences. People know who we are, and the Star Trek community is pretty tight. But we talked about it extensively, and we really wanted to not, I guess we wanted to fail on our own terms. So this was the first time that we had ever done anything like this. We were putting ourselves through film school, essentially, by doing this film. We wanted to be able to make our mistakes with our own money. And so we did. Like, there were stumbles, but it's a learning experience, right? There's ups and downs, and I think for the most part, we had a great time doing it. And we did learn a lot about ourselves and the industry, and how to make a film. And so certainly, I think it gives me more confidence going into a next project. If I decide to crowdfund for it, I will know now how much to budget for, like, a colorist. Someone's got to color the film. Like, that, hiring what's called a DIT, like someone to manage the file system for your film, is really important. So all of those things, like, we really needed to learn. And now I feel confident putting a budget together for a film, and
Mm.
how to hire the right people to do that, and what kind of questions to ask, and how you get people involved in a movie. All of those things. I'm glad we did all those risks just with our own money. And a handful of very dedicated, wonderful friends who were able to help bail us out at times. But going into the next ones, I think at least now I feel confident. If I were to ask for the general public's money to get a movie made, I feel confident knowing how to do it now.
Now you can use other people's money to figure out what you're doing.
Right. Right. But it's fun. I mean, I will tell those stories. And if I do have the opportunity, whether it's the general public or whether it's with an investor, I know how to do it now. And that brings a lot of delight. And I do think I was good at it. That's one of the most exciting things I think anyone can relate to, when they find that career where you're like, oh, I enjoy this. And also, I think I'm pretty good at it. And other people tell me I'm good at it. And that's huge. That's really nice.
So in the future, your Spacetime Productions, is it going to be themed? The movies and films you're trying to work on, they're going to be themed around science, around diversity. or are they going to be, is that going to be like a focus of films going forward for you?
Think I naturally gravitate towards sci-fi films, and with my background and like I said of having been inspired by women who were on screen as scientists, I think that's something I would personally really like to continue doing is again this story every morning. It doesn't necessarily have to do with them being scientists. They just are scientists. And so telling more stories like that where people can be like, "Oh, they're on some other like weird wacky adventure, but like they also happen to be a forensic biologist." Like that's
Right,
really interesting, you know? And so when I had that epiphany of just realizing that like my job was not to be Dana Scully, it was to write Dana Scully. It's like that also extends into producing, is telling the story of these characters and getting that out there. But you know, I'm open to it. I know I like live action, I know I like sci-fi, but I do want to keep it really with that theme of representation mattering and giving opportunities both behind the camera as well as in front.
So you're now the science advisor for the entire Star Trek franchise, which is now three major shows.
5 shows.
Oh, we're counting the cartoon as well.
Yeah.
Lower Decks is part of that. I wasn't sure because
Yep.
it's kind of funny cartoon. I wasn't sure if they actually had the science. They were that involved with that part as well. And was it so Prodigy, Strange New
Yep.
Worlds, Discovery, and Picard.
And Picard and Lower Decks. Yep.
Yeah. So you got the 5 there. So what does a science advisor actually do on these shows?
That's a great question. My role is slightly different for every single show. The most important brief I have is to make sure no one says anything wrong. That's the most important thing. And so every script that comes across my desk, that's what I'm checking. And every script comes across my desk. So it's a lot of reading, making sure all the dialogue makes sense, making sure kind of the general theme works. But from then on, it varies. Now, my philosophy as a science advisor is to yes and the process. So they want to do some weird, wacky multiverse time travel, timey-wimey story, like awesome, sure, go for it.
Right.
I will make sure we just don't overstep when it comes to the science. But even if we do overstep, maybe it's just best if we don't explain it. And so giving that advising aspect as well is really important. Now, with a show like Star Trek Discovery, that is very science focused. So that was the first show I worked on, was for season 3 of Discovery. That's when Michelle Paradise took over as showrunner, doing the story of the burn. And then they had one episode where they had a seed vault that got hit by a coronal mass ejection. So that's what I did there. But the core of Discovery is very science driven. The characters are scientists. They're problem solving. There are problems to solve. And so I work all the way like from story area where they're coming up with the ideas all the way through post-production, making sure the equations on screen are right, making sure all the planets look right. And so that's pretty extensive. With Picard and Strange New Worlds, you know, they're telling slightly different stories, and especially like Strange New Worlds harkens so much back to the original series, and so they push those limits a little bit more. And what I do with them is more writing the on-screen, you know, copy, making all the data about the planets look right, and again reading the scripts, helping out with any episodes that are science focused. Lower Decks, I just make sure they don't say anything wrong and just double check some stuff for them. And sometimes we do get to do some fun ones. The season 2 finale of Lower Decks, where they ended up in a solar system that had this weird, you know, energy belt thing that was happening that they had to navigate. I did get to do some fun stuff with that. And then with Prodigy, my role is a little more unique in the sense that I still help the science sound right, but my role is more of a STEM educator for that show because it is targeted to a kid audience. It's trying to inspire future generations. So it's more like, as a scientist, as a woman scientist, like how would we be able to tap into that demographic and excite the kids and explain stuff in a way that kids would understand. So it's a slightly different role in that sense. But yeah, across the board, I mean, it's fun.
Well, I think the thing that I find fascinating about what you do for Star Trek, okay, as a science advisor, you're dealing with Star Trek, which we're dealing with 23rd century, the 24th century, the 32nd century, I believe, as well. You're dealing with time periods so far advanced that you're almost diving into sci-fi fantasy.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about what is right and what is accurate, what is possible, how do you determine what is possible 1,000 years from now, where things are
Yeah.
probably are not only is our knowledge base probably gonna be totally different on what we understand, but the technology is so far advanced, it's hard to determine is that even possible? Because once again, from our perspective, almost anything. I can't remember who it was. The idea that anything so far advanced is basically indistinguishable from magic.
It's magic. Yeah,
Right, right.
exactly.
So as a science but how do you look at something from the 32nd century and go, that makes sense, or no, that's not possible?
Yeah, thankfully, I have 55, 56 years now of canon and previous technology that we can rely on. So even though transporters themselves have no grounding in science because you need to know where every single particle is, and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle says you can't. But in the next generation, they said they have a Heisenberg compensator in the transporter system. Sure, it compensates for
Convenient.
the Heisenberg principle. I love that example because it's a way of just saying, like, look, we know the physics is nonsense, but it's the future. We solved for it. We have a Heisenberg
Right.
compensator. How does it work? It works really well. Thank you.
It compensates, god damn it. It
Yeah,
compensates.
exactly. But then I get asked about like the detachable nacelles that we had in Discovery in the 32nd century. And for me, I'm like, well, we have induction. Like some of those principles still work. When you drive over those little circles on a stop, at a stoplight, it's not a pressure pad, it's an induction coil, and it's picking up the metal from your car and inducing a current that then tells the system that there's a car there. And
Hmm.
so the principle of induction and transferring electromagnetic energy without touching is totally fine. Now, have I worked out all of the physics of how detachable nacelles would work? Of course not. But there are these like little science principles that you can fold into it that still make it seem believable to some extent. But yeah, I think the most important thing technologically and scientifically that I do is really making sure that we're consistent across the shows, making sure that the way we talk about transporters or the way we talk about replicators or warp drive or any of those stays consistent. I think that's the most important thing.
So basically you're talking about technological continuity.
Yeah, exactly. Managing the star dates, that's also on my job radar. Is fun.
So you're thinking of like tech continuity, okay? You're once again not only looking for science accuracy, but science accuracy versus the within the fictional universe of Star Trek. So not only are you well versed now in real world astrophysics, but you're now like the doctor of Star Trek astrophysics, which is a totally different world. So yeah, so how did you get like that knowledgeable in the Star Trek tech versus real tech?
Yeah, I mean it's funny. It's like I am the closest you can get to a warp drive expert. It actually came from, it's kind of how I got this job in the first place actually was when I left academia, I really missed teaching and I would go to sci-fi conventions and teach the physics behind Star Trek. Talk about how replicators work. I love using pop culture to teach science. We talked about having reference points. That's what's so great about science fiction is you can say like, you see this example, like that's why that could work in this circumstance, or this is why it doesn't work, this is why it's science fiction. And so I did that for, gosh, probably 8 years or so. I mean, I've been doing it for over 10 years at this point, but that was kind of how I got my foot in the door with Star Trek, was going to these conventions, giving these talks, using Star Trek to teach physics. And they were hugely popular. I mean, people love this stuff. And I could say it, people love this shit. It's amazing. And I just think, so that kind of got me on their radar in terms of like, oh man, like not only does she know all the physics, but she also knows the physics of all of this Trek technology and can explain it in different ways and come up with weird, wacky, justifications or explanations for this stuff. And yeah, that's kind of what got me on CBS's radar in the first place.
That out there. So when you're thinking about once again Star Trek and you're developing and you're getting your scripts, okay? As a writer as well, are you also, I mean, do you ever have the temptation to either fix the writing, which is could be bad. Like, you know what, the technology is perfect, but here's what I need to talk to you about the writing stuff. No, I mean, do you ever like kind of get that itch to kind of make a writing comment? And because you are so versed in the technology anyway, when is your episode going to come out that you're writing?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I actually got into writing because I was doing all of this consulting and working particularly in Star Trek and trying to think like, okay, this job isn't going to be forever. You know, this production company is more recent development, but even a few years ago is kind of where I started getting into screenwriting. And a lot of that was inspired by the previous science consultants for Star Trek, who were Narain Shakar and Andre Bermanis, who went on to write episodes and then become writers and then showrunners and executive producers. Narain Shankar is the showrunner for The Expanse, and his first job in Hollywood was Star Trek science advising. And so I've been lucky enough to be able to, get some mentorship from them. And the landscape is very different. At that time, when there were 26 episode orders for a season, then it would be like, sure, give the science consultant a try. Let them write one. That's fine. With only 10 to 13 episodes a season, that becomes a little bit more difficult. So I am learning a lot. One of the things I do when I do write my notes, though, is I always give the science up front. I usually go by like, this is the stuff that needs to be changed, just little dialogue tweaks here and there, numbers changing, things like that. Then I have suggestions where it's like, yeah, the science isn't wrong, but if you want to beef it up or if you want to explain it this way, that might make more sense. And then I give additional notes. And sometimes that's really helpful because I do sit in the writer's room, but I'm not there every single day like the writers are. So I haven't been embedded in the story as much as they are. So I'm at least I'm one of those passes that can just be like, this kind of bumped me, or like, this didn't really make sense to me. I always still try to offer alternatives, and I never like crap on the entire storyline. It's usually just moments where it's called, getting bumped, where it's like kind of pulls me out. It doesn't quite make sense. And I try to just flag those in a helpful way, in a positive way. But it's fun. Being in 5 writers' rooms at once has been a fire hose of a learning opportunity, like just to see how different rooms are run, to see what the writing process is like, to understand what a writer's room looks like and how they operate and how they can vary. I'm just soaking in the knowledge is all I'm trying to do at this point.
So what happened? I mean, I'm sure there's been times where the science and the story clash, where something has to exist to make the story happen, but you can't come up with a good scientific reason why it could happen. So in your experience, what tends to win, the story or the science?
The story always wins. The story always wins. And like I said, sometimes it just means we back off the science explanation a little bit, that, there was maybe one in the script already where they said the quantum blah, 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 the blah, blah, blah did this. And then it's like, if we get rid of that, that's okay. But really, I think it's one of the hardest lessons to learn in this industry is just kind of finding that balance of being a positive force, having a good energy, but still contributing in a meaningful way, and not stepping on other people who have been doing this a lot longer than me. Staff writers for Star Trek are very talented people who've been in it for a long time. And watching their process and having the opportunity to sort of shadow the room, a lot of times, like, my biggest learning experience is kind of watching them break a story, because I'll just be sitting, I'm there to learn, right? I'm not there to be involved. And I'll kind of have an idea where I'm like, ooh, I bet this would be cool. Or like, ooh, I don't know if that works. But then I keep my mouth shut and then they get to it. That it's like the other people come up with it. And that's what I think is so cool, that when you get these talented storytellers together, they're able to go through that process and work through it, that I don't think I ever appreciated before.
Because I think one thing that you said was kind of interesting, for when the story concept I always wondered about. For instance, like, I think it was the season 3 that had you mentioned the burn.
Yeah.
Now, scientifically, the idea of this guy having this mental breakdown and everything breaks down in warp for a whole galaxy is probably not feasible. But how did you work it to make sure it, at least to you, it was scientifically acceptable?
That was my first assignment in Star Trek.
Really?
Yes. Was them saying, we have this idea for this kid who cries out and he broke all the dilithium, and we want science behind that.
So where do you get
um
started?
yeah, I got started by looking up everything that we have said about dilithium up until then. So what science has been given. So one important thing was noting that like dilithium isn't fuel itself. It's more of a regulator. It balances the matter antimatter reactions in the warp core. And then realizing how much hadn't been said about dilithium. And so with the parameters of like this kid crying out, breaking a crystal, then I start thinking about resonant frequencies, right? This idea of the opera singer in a wine glass, that you can hit the resonant frequency of an object and cause it to shatter. That's a physics principle. So, okay, so let's go with resonant frequencies. Well, the other parameter that I'm working in is it has to go faster than the speed of light, but not instantaneous, right? If we're talking about a whole quadrant or the whole galaxy being affected by this, I mean, if it was going at the speed of light, that's hundreds and thousands of years that it would take for that to propagate. But it couldn't be instant either, because remember, Burnham had to triangulate where it happened by knowing it hit here, then here, then here, and you can kind of backtrace it. And so I, as the old standby for Star Trek, I'm like, all right, if we're going faster than light, we're going into subspace. Because subspace isn't beholden to the faster than light rule. And we have tons of subspace stuff in Star Trek, things like subspace comms buoys, right? Those all exist. And so what if dilithium had a component that penetrated subspace? And then so I was thinking, well, like, what components would there be? We still have to have tangible dilithium, right? We have scenes where Scotty is like playing with the crystal dilithium. But what if there were these subatomic particles that are connected to subspace as well as normal space? You know, we have gluons and quarks and all of these things that kind of hold atoms together. What if there is a subatomic equivalent of that? That, I mean, honestly, who knows? There might be. We don't know what dark matter is, right? so,
right.
So you see those weird things, like you can start to pull that out. And so that was the science I started baking into it, was that dilithium had a subspace component that happened to be at the resonant frequency. And then my partner in crime that season was Professor Mohammed Noor, who's a biology professor from Duke. His brief was to like science Sukhal, the child himself, and find out how he would be tapped more into dilithium, how he'd be protected from the radiation, what made him unique and different. And so working together, we kind of were able to put a scientific backbone into that. Now, everything that I just said, I think made it into a line and a half of dialogue. That I think Culber got to say once in the midst of a bunch of other stuff going on. But the point is that backbone is there, right? And that as the writers are deciding what they're going to say or how much or how little they should explain it, they at least have something to reference. They're not making it up on the fly. So that was a really fun challenge, and I'm actually really proud of it. If people are interested, Muhammad and I did write an article for StarTrek.com called "The Science of the Burn."
Oh,
and
very
you can look
cool.
it up. Yeah, it's dives into basically everything I just said, but you can hear more about Sukhal and the biology there as well.
That's so cool. So does it ever drive you crazy when you have this big explanation for the science and the information, and then they just kind of toss out a line like, oh yeah, it's blah blah blah, and you're just like, that's not the whole damn thing. And you're like, does it ever drive you crazy? You're like, no, I need to handle it. You know, they need to explain it in like another paragraph. Give me credit.
Yeah, I mean, it is tough sometimes. What's great though is I think there are people who recognize when there is a lot of science behind it, where it's like that one line that Culber says, it's said in a way where they're like, oh no, they've thought about that. Like there has to be some science there. So that's sometimes good enough. And the greatest honor has ever been bestowed to me is how this was reflected in, like I mentioned before, the season 2 finale of Star Trek Lower Decks, when they're trying to think of ways that they can go past this asteroid belt without damaging the ship. And Lieutenant Kayshawn goes like, why don't we just warp past the debris? And the whole bridge like comically just shouts in his face. And if you listen really carefully, Shax shouts, Dr. Erin said we can't do that. That's as much explanation as they give, but at least like I've made it into a little bit of canon, and that was the explanation. Dr. Erin said we can't warp past the debris.
Eventually they gotta name a ship after you.
One day, right?
That is awesome. And are you also in charge of the medical tech as well? Like when you go to the doctor, do you handle that as well?
So I'm like the first pass. So the way that Professor Knorr references it is like I'm the sheriff and then I just call in a bunch of deputies. Like that I'll read sort of the technical stuff, but again, it's a smell test, right? Like I have enough of a scientific background to at least know what needs to be checked. And so when they're talking about the medical stuff, knowing what's Star Trek tech versus what's actual science and medicine, then I'll do kind of a first pass to see if I can quickly look it up. You know, I think that's some of the skill set that I got from my PhD and from graduate school and doing research, is that I can quickly look this stuff up and distill it and understand it in a fundamental way. But then if it needs more, I will kind of pass it on to people and just say like, hey, does this sentence make sense? And don't ask me who's saying it or for what show. I'm just asking if this sentence that came out of my mouth makes sense.
that is absolutely awesome. So what else is in your future now?
The entertainment industry is a fun adventure. So every morning in the premiere of that and getting that out to festivals is kind of the most immediate thing. Hoping to continue to work on Star Trek, I think is sort of the next big priority. And then for me, continuing to learn to screenwrite. I think I'm in a really good point in my career where I could be staffed in a room as a staff writer. Like I said, I have the experience to know how these writers' rooms work, and I think I could contribute to a writer's room really well. So I'm working towards that, just continuing to kind of hone that craft, get my samples as good as they can be. I have a few good ones, but you can always work on more. And then just continuing to kind of put myself out there and get those opportunities.
Very cool. And I wish you the best future possible. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. You're absolutely awesome and absolutely fascinating. And one day I want you back on so I can pick your brain about more stuff.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a fantastic night.
Yeah, you too.